Good morning. Good morning. Good to see everybody. I thought before we get going, Doug, I know a lot of you are concerned about election results. You're concerned about the direction of the country. You're concerned about where we're going, what's going to happen in the next 60 days. And if you don't mind, this morning, I know this is a Sabbath school class, but somehow we always mix our politics and religion no matter what we do. So I just wanted to share with you some things that were very comforting to me that a former U.S. Senator shared with me this past week, that you can take it as the truth. He is no longer a senator, but he knows what's going on in D.C. First of all, Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell are very good friends, but you would not really know that with the news. They're good friends, and when Joe Biden's son died 5 years ago, McConnell was at the funeral. And when Obama could not get things done, and they were fighting with McConnell, he sent Joe Biden across the street to get it worked out with McConnell. Okay? So the country will probably survive. You worry about big tax increases. That probably won't happen unless we get a majority of Democratic senators. And that probably won't happen because McConnell just sent $150 million to Georgia last week to help our two senators there. Now, also, young people are worried about our Paris Accords. Well, we're all worried about it, and our environment. You know, Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords. But yet, the benchmarks that were set for the United States in Paris, we met them. We already met those benchmarks because we're not a dominantly fossil fuel burning country anymore. So take hope. I know we're warming, and I know that things will still change, but it's not like we haven't done anything positive for the environment. These were things that were rather comforting. In the Middle East, he believes that the young people are taking the Middle East are going to take it over. The Israeli children grow up to be soldiers for 2 years and have to serve in the military for 2 years. Are very bright, and they want to get along with their Arab neighbors. They are in the process of discussing over the next 10 years how they build an economy in the Middle East. So there's hope. There's hope.
Can we all bring our personal problems to you now to solve?
Good morning.
Good answer.
I can't hear you, Mark. I don't know if that's a blessing. I'm sorry, what were you saying?
You have your hearing aids?
I'm just kidding.
This is a new person to our class, George Knight.
George.
Roberts. Did it
Robert
wrong.
Knight.
Anyway, it's George, and he's coming to visit our class, and he may come again.
Well,
If you,
I
oh, you,
hope so.
okay.
Thank you. Welcome. Welcome. Anyway, these are things that, there are other things that I had to share with you. Well, that's enough for now. But I think that we'll be moving in the right direction. And I think there's hope for obviously hope for our country.
Because God's in control.
Amen. Well, with that said, Randy, would you mind having a prayer this morning?
Sure. Dear Lord, we're so thankful for the Sabbath day. It's truly a blessing where we can put our cares behind us for a day, recharge, and learn more about you. And we hope that what we learned today can bring us closer to you, and by us drawing closer to you, bring others closer to you as well. Bless the teacher today, and bless people who can't be here today, as well as bless the remainder of us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you. Doug Tilstra is our teacher. So Doug, if you're ready, we're ready.
I'm ready. Can you hear me okay? Is the volume good?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, good. I'd like you to do a short exercise, a short writing exercise before I give you an introductory story to jump into our Bible passage. So have a piece of paper or maybe your phone that you take some notes on, and I'd like you to actually write something down because at the end of the class, I'm going to have you look at it again. So when you're ready, I will give you this little short writing exercise, pen, paper, phone, something to write on. I'll give you a moment for that. So here's the little writing exercise. I want you to answer 2 questions. I'll give them to you one at a time. What does it mean for me to accept Jesus? Now, let me word this differently. What does it look like for me to accept God as my king? What does it look like for me to accept God as my king? I know that's kind of a big, almost Hallmark card sounding cliche. Do your best. What does it look like for me to accept God as my king? And realizing that this whole study of the life of David is really a big picture about kingship. We'll come back to that in a minute. What does it look like for me to accept God as my king? Just jot down a phrase or so in there. What does it look like for me to accept God as my king? Okay, second question. Only 2 questions on this quiz. Second question is, what does it look like for me to reject God as my king? What does it look like for me to reject God as my king? And I hope you don't write down C above opposite. What does it look like for me to reject God as my king? Okay, tuck that away. We'll come back to that at the very end of the lesson, because that's a big picture of where we're going with this lesson. Now, let me tell you a real brief, I hope, introductory story. It was New Year's Eve of 1975. I was 19 years old, had just started college, and was home for the holidays where my parents were living in the Redwoods, Humboldt County, Northern California. And as always, my parents had a big New Year's party with mostly extended family coming from really across the state and even out of state. And some friends, but mostly extended family. And these New Year's parties were always big events. It was really the biggest event of the holidays, kind of a Dutch tradition. And this particular evening, for some reason, my grandfather and I, my dad's dad, called him Opa. Opa and I were not a part of all of the other conversations and everything else that was going on. Somehow we were kind of off in the corner, and it was really kind of an unusual moment. I wasn't that close to my Opa. I didn't see him that often. And I'm very sad that this is probably one of the more significant conversations we had. And it was one of the last conversations. Shortly after that, he became ill. His mind was not as clear. I moved out of the area. And so it was probably one of the last conversations that we had, and probably one of the few conversations we had. And I realized how much I missed because I wasn't old enough, mature enough to have appreciated conversations with him earlier. So here in this conversation, for some reason, he began telling me stories of his boyhood in Holland. Those are rich times when you can hear stories of a previous generation. And then he quickly zeroed in on one particular friendship. A young man that he was friends with in Holland, and they ended up working together, traveling together as they grew into young men. And then they both ended up coming to America eventually, separately and at different times. And their lives progressed with marriage, children, and the stories went on with, of course, I've told you some stories about my grandfather, his mission service, and the time spent in prison camp and the death of his wife there. So, I mean, these stories took all kinds of twists and turns, but the storyline he was following was the storyline of his friendship with this young man. And as the story traced down to the next generation, and then the next generation, and even the generation beyond that, I knew some of these people. Now there were people in the story that I didn't know well, but I recognized their names. I'd met them a time or two at some gatherings where family and extended family and friends got together. And I'm sure that Opa had a moral to this story. And he was not just rambling about stories in general. He was telling me the story of his friendship with this young man and his family and grandkids and great-grandkids on down the line for a reason. He was trying to make some point about traits that he had noticed in this young man when they were still both single bachelors working their way to pay for tuition and go to school. And some of those especially unlovely traits, objectionable traits that trace down from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next. And I don't even remember exactly what the moral of the story was, but what I do remember and what struck me as so profound as a 19-year-old, that you could live long enough to have that kind of perspective. That you could live long enough to know not just something about your own life, and not just the life of the next generation or the next generation after that, but 2 or 3 generations beyond that. And I remember to this day, that happened over 40 years ago. In that moment, marveling what it must be like to have that kind of perspective, to take that kind of a long view of life. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a long view, not just of 2 or 3 generations, but of dozens of generations, because that, in fact, is the perspective that God offers us in Scripture. And oftentimes, in order to understand any story, we need to take the long view. And we need to look, yes, at the details of that story in front of us, but we may miss what's going on in that story if we don't take the long view and say, what was going on a generation before this? What went on a generation after this? 2 generations before this? 3 generations before this? 3 or 4 generations after this? And the Scripture is one long story that invites us to take a very long view. And the long view that we're going to take today is going to come back to this question of, what does it mean to accept God as King? What does it mean to reject God as King? Now, push the pause button. We're going to go straight to our story, and we're going to read it right through. We're going to look at the details. We're going to zero in on 2 Samuel chapter 13. And then we're going to pull back and do a bit of a long view. So open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 13. 2 Samuel chapter 13. And John Cosgrove led us last week in an excellent study of the first half of this chapter. Now we're considering the second half, but we're going to read the entire chapter to make sure that we are up and running with the whole story. I'll read it aloud, and I'm going to start with verse 1 and end with the last verse in chapter 13, which is 39. So just follow along. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Amnon became frustrated to the point of illness on account of his sister Tamar. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. Now Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. He asked Amnon, "Why do you, the king's son, look so haggard morning after morning? Won't you tell me?" Amnon said to him, "I'm in love with Tamar, my brother Absalom's sister." "Go to bed and pretend to be ill," Jonadab said. "When your father comes to see you, say to him, 'I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Let her prepare the food in my sight so I may watch her and then eat it from her hand.'" So Amnon lay down and pretended to be ill. When the king came to see him, Amnon said to him, "I would like my sister Tamar to come and make some special bread in my sight so I may eat from her hand." David sent word to Tamar at the palace, "Go to the house of your brother Amnon and prepare some food for him." So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Then she took the pan and served him the bread that he refused to eat. "Send everyone out of here," Amnon said. So everyone left him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, "Bring the food in here into my bedroom so that I may eat from your hand." And Tamar took the bread she had prepared and brought it to her brother Amnon in his bedroom. When she took it to him to eat, he grabbed her and said, "Come to bed with me, my sister." "Don't, my brother," she said to him. "Don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. What about me? Where could I get rid of my disgrace? What about you? You would be like one of the wicked fools in Israel. Please speak to the king. He will not keep me from being married to you." But he refused to listen to her, and since he was stronger than she, he raped her. Then Amnon hated her with intense hatred. In fact, he hated her more than he had loved her. Amnon said to her, "Get up and get out." "No," she said to him, "sending me away would be a greater wrong than what you've already done to me." But he refused to listen to her. He called his personal servant and said, "Get this woman out of here. Bolt the door after her." So his servant put her out, bolted the door after her. She was wearing a richly ornamented robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ornamented robe she was wearing. She put her hand on her head and went away, weeping aloud as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, "Has that Amnon, your brother, been with you?" "Be quiet now, my sister. He is your brother. Don't take this thing to heart." And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. When King David heard all this, he was furious. Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hazor, near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. Absalom went to the king and said, "Your servant has shearers come. Will the king and his officials please join me?" "No, my son," the king replied, "all of us should not go. We would only be a burden to you." Although Absalom urged him, he still refused to go, but gave him his blessing. Then Absalom said, "If not, please let my brother Amnon come with us." The king asked him, "Why should he go with you?" But Absalom urged him, so he sent with him Amnon and the rest of the king's sons. Absalom ordered his men, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, 'Strike Amnon down,' then kill him. Don't be afraid. Have not I given you this order? Be strong and brave." So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. When they were on their way, the report came to David, Absalom has struck down all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. The king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground, and all of his servants stood by with their clothes torn. But Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother, said, my lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead. This has been Absalom's expressed intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. My lord the king should not be concerned about the report that all the king's sons are dead. Only Amnon is dead. Meanwhile, Absalom had fled. Now the man standing watch looked up and saw many people on the road west of him, coming down the side of the hill. The watchman went and told the king, I see men in the direction of Hornaim on the side of the hill. Jonadab said to the king, see, king's sons are here. It has happened just as your servant said. As he finished speaking, the king's sons came in, wailing loudly. The king too, and all his servants wept very bitterly. Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. David mourned for his son every day. After Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. What a wretched, tragic story. And if that were the only glimpse that we had of this story, we might feel like we were looking into an open cesspool or into a oozing wound that has pus and goo coming out of it. It's not a pretty picture. And John, you did a marvelous job last week leading us into seeing something of redemptive value in the first part of this story. And I really appreciate it. And today we're going to look at this story in total, taking it right through a 5-year period. In this story, we read it in 10 minutes or less, but this story takes 5 years to play out. And we're going to look at the larger view that is even larger than those 5 years. And let me paint that picture for you, and I'd like to engage you in some discussion. If we look at the largest view, we would go clear back to the book of Genesis and realize that what we have in the book of Genesis is the story of the beginning of God's people under the leadership of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, then his 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel, and particularly Joseph, who kind of takes a lead role, even though he is not the oldest, the firstborn. And from there, we have the development of God's people, their enslavement, their release from Egypt and slavery, under the leadership of Moses. And so now we see God leading his people not through the patriarchs, but through Moses. And Moses' leadership gets handed off to Joshua. And after Joshua dies and they are settled in the land of Canaan, everything kind of goes haywire. Everything becomes a mess. And that takes us into the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges, it is like, again, looking into an open cesspool. It's like looking into a rotting wound that has gangrene and pus coming out of it. And the book of Judges is sick. And we're going to actually go there in a little bit. And one of the refrains in the book of Judges is, there was no king in that day, and everyone did what they saw fit in their own eyes. And you get the idea, oh, so the answer is that they need a king to whip them into shape. And that's exactly where the story goes next into the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, is you have the beginning of the monarchy. Now, the monarchy is not a great idea. And Samuel tells the people that, but they say, no, we want a king. And we'll look a little bit more about that in a moment. But looking at this big picture, it appears as if, initially, the monarchy and getting a king is a good idea. And Saul's early reign takes the people in some good directions. They, whew, we're out of those terrible days of the judges when everything was just helter-skelter and chaos. But then that doesn't last long. And as you know, most of the 40 years that Saul spends as king, he is so jealous of David, well, not most of the years, many of the years, he is so jealous of David, he spends a lot of his energy just chasing David around, trying to keep him from getting the throne after he's gone. When Saul finally dies and David comes to king again, we go, whew, glad that's over. And we've seen the rise and fall of Saul, but now we're going to see the rise and fall of David. And David comes on as king. And now we say, okay, finally the monarchy is getting off to some good start. But it's not to be. And the turning point in David's life comes with the story of Bathsheba, which we, of course, studied a couple of weeks ago. And now the monarchy's on a way downhill again. And what we're in the middle of is this downhill slide. And it goes down hard and fast and ugly. And so we see the rise and fall of Saul, and we see the rise and fall of David, and we begin to get an idea. Maybe God knew what he was talking about, that this monarchy thing is just not a good idea. Power tends to go to people's heads, and they tend to abuse and misuse it and turn people away from God. And if that's the idea, the big picture you're getting from these stories, you're getting the intent that the author has. Because the monarchy was never a great idea. It was a second-rate idea at best. But in the detail of telling the stories, we see this thing play out, as you so well put last week, John, in this slow motion, where it just is, oh no. And you told last week some marvelous stories about car accidents and seeing things in slow motion, just saying, I can't stop this thing, and here it comes. This train wreck is about to happen. And that's really what we're in for with the rest of 2 Samuel and on into 1 and 2 Kings. It's this train wreck in slow motion. And remember that most of these stories existed in oral tradition until they were finally compiled, written down many years later, when the monarchy is done, when the people, hundreds of years later, are in exile in Babylon with the last king, the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson of David, taken off the throne, made a prisoner of war, and the people thrown into captivity in Babylon for 70 years. And everybody's scratching their head and saying, what went wrong? And at this time, the stories that trace the rise and fall of the first two kings, Saul and David, become incredibly relevant. Because God says, you want to know what went wrong? It's not something recent, it's something old. It's something that took place clear back at the beginning of this whole project. And if you hear this without me sounding like I'm swearing, this whole damned project of the monarchy, because it was damned from the very beginning. And yet God says, let's work with it. If that's really what you are bent on having, we will try to make this thing work as best we can. But it's a train wreck waiting to happen. And people say, well, we want it anyway. And so they jump in with all fours into this train wreck. And now several hundred years later, while they're in exile, after the monarchy has completely been destroyed, they're reflecting on these stories that have been around for a long time, but they are pulled together in a way that they can see them back to back to back to back to back. Like my Opah's story. Now they have a long view that they wouldn't have had. And they say, oh. Now, that's the big picture, okay? And I know that took just a little while for me to give you that big picture. But let's come back to the story. And let's say, okay, how does this story fit into that big picture? And here I'm going to suggest, and I'll put something on the screen in just a moment, but I'm going to suggest that this slice of that story is a phrase that we're going to repeat several times, looking at the story here a story in Judges, and then a story in the life of Jesus. And we're going to look at these three stories in succession because that's the longer view of this monarchy idea, this kingship idea, and the idea that ultimately it's God who wants to be king and not some human king. So here's the sentence. Men in power use and abuse a vulnerable woman for their own selfish purposes. Men in power use and abuse a vulnerable woman for their own selfish purposes. And the root issue is the rejection of divine king. Now that's the sentence, two sentences really, that we're going to take a look at this story. We're going to view this story through that lens. Then we're going to go back and see that same issue in the book of Judges. And then we're going to go forward and see it in the life of Jesus, because that's the longest view when the king himself comes to live among us. And how do we accept or reject that king who's come to live among us? Let's take a look at that. And I'll put this up on the screen in just a moment, but I want you to now take a look at this story, whether you were here or not. And welcome, by the way. Is it George? George, did I get the name right? Help me out, Marge. You're here for the first time.
George Roberts.
George, you're here for the first time. Whether or not you were here for the previous discussions, you can jump right in because you have enough background. Maybe you are familiar enough with this story. But what we're going to do is look at this story in light of what we've studied over the last few weeks. And I want to have you take a look at big picture from just this story now, kind of the 5-year view of who are the men in power here. Let's tick them off. Who are the men in power in 2 Samuel chapter 13? This should not take too long to name them. Let me hear from you. And people who are watching online. Who are the men in power? I'm inviting you to speak up here.
David.
Okay, David's in power. Who else? Who else has some power, some influence here?
Absalom.
Absalom, good. I think I heard another one. What was the other one?
Amnon.
Amnon, good. And you're missing one more. Jonadab. Now, you realize that Jonadab is a cousin to both Amnon and Absalom. He is the son of David's brother. And of course, Amnon and Absalom are half brothers. They have different mothers. Right? So we have these 4 men, Amnon, Absalom, Jonadab, and David. Now, who is the vulnerable woman in this story?
Tamar.
Tamar. That one's easy. Okay. So we have these men in power. We have the vulnerable woman. Now, how do each of these men use either this woman or the situation around this woman for their own selfish purposes? Let's start with Amnon. How does Amnon use her for his own selfish purposes?
He rapes her.
He rapes her. He's gratifying his own lust. That's his part of this. How about Absalom? How does he use this situation for his own selfish purposes? With the woman at the center of it, but how does he use this situation for his own selfish purposes?
Was Amnon the oldest?
I'm sorry?
So Amnon was the oldest son of
Amnon was the oldest. Okay, so let's just do a little bit of recap here. You'll find this in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. These all have different mothers. Well, not all. Amnon and Absalom have different mothers, but Absalom and Tamar have the same mother. And of course, the dad is David for all of them. But we have, in 2 Samuel 3, we have Amnon, who's the firstborn. So he's presumably the heir to the throne. Then we have another one. I can't think of his name right now. I think it begins with a K. And he's never spoken of again. And the presumption is he probably dies quite young because he's never heard of him. And then third in line is Absalom. So you're onto something here. Yeah. Yeah, he's maybe looking to bump off the guy ahead of him so that he can have the throne. Yeah, good thought. Okay, so that's Absalom. He's getting revenge. He's avenging the dishonor of his sister. There's a possible grab for the throne. What about Jonadab? And some of this is review from what you did last week. I know that John led you in this discussion. What does Jonadab have to gain for his own selfish purposes here? Look at the story. He shows up at the beginning of the story and at the end of the story.
Jonadab's playing both sides of it, actually.
He's playing both sides. And remember the description of him, depending on the translation, it says he was a very shrewd man, or one paraphrase says he was very streetwise. NIV says very shrewd. So here's a guy who is playing the politics. He is playing the power. What does he have to gain in all of this? What's his agenda?
His position in Absalom's kingdom, that Absalom's going to be the king.
Yeah. He's currying the favor of more powerful men. Yeah. Okay, and finally, David. What are David's selfish purposes that are playing out here?
Perhaps because of David's own raping of Bathsheba, he doesn't defend his daughter. So he doesn't take the issue at hand, just sidesteps it.
He does not defend his daughter. He does not stand up for her. Anybody else? Let me suggest that he's indulging his own anxiety, shame, and sorrow. Even though he's been forgiven, obviously, these consequences in his life are handcuffing him from doing what a dad really ought to be doing here. Let me share my screen with you here and just summarize some of these things that you have been saying. Okay, with sharing my screen, I'm not seeing you anymore. And so you're going to have to tell me, can you see this? Somebody speak up. Can you see this okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so you've got the men in power, Amnon, Absalom, Jonadab, and David. You've got the use and abuse of a vulnerable woman, Tamar. And you have their own selfish purposes. Amnon is gratifying his lust. Absalom is gaining revenge and avenging the dishonor. He's possibly making a grab for the throne. Jonadab is currying the favor of more powerful men. And David is indulging his own anxiety, shame, and sorrow, which leads to very repulsive inaction. Okay? Now that's just a bit of a summary. Let me stop sharing my screen and direct you to the long view and the bigger picture. We need to go back about 100 years. And we're going to look at the closing story in the book of Judges. And if you thought this story is repulsive and horrid and like looking into a big cesspool, you ain't seen nothing yet. And I'm going to try to spare you some of the worst part of it. We're going to read selections. If you want to later go back and read the whole thing, you can. But this story comes from the last 3 chapters of Judges. So turn to the book of Judges. And this all happens about 100 years before. So this is not that far back. It's several generations earlier. And remember what I said at the beginning of class here. This is the closing of that time period between Moses and Samuel. It's that time period when things got really chaotic and everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. And the repeated refrain in the book of Judges is there was no king in the land and everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes. And things just spiraled down horribly. And here's a story, and here's the interesting thing. I will spare you the comparisons, but the final 3 chapters, well, it's actually more than that. It's chapter 19, 20, 21, basically the last 3 chapters. Let me give you the quick view, and then we'll look at it in more detail. It is the story of another very violent rape that leads to a power struggle within the family, and both literary parallels, thematic parallels, and even linguistic parallels. And scholars will spend, as you probably can appreciate, they will spend hours, volumes, and I have read summaries of some of these, looking at the literary parallels, the linguistic parallels, the thematic parallels between various stories of the Bible, which for one thing helps us understand the long view better, but for another thing really gives us confidence that God is behind the telling of this long story, because just as my Opa was able to look at the long view and say, here's what happened in 1910, here's what happened in 1950, here's what happened in 1970, and he could look at this long view, and he told a story thematically so that I got the point. God is able to do that. And the last 3 chapters of Judges parallel in more than half a dozen ways the story of 2 Samuel 13. And we really can't understand the long view of this story of the monarchy without going all the way back to Judges and before and seeing what God is doing to help people understand this monarchy idea was a lousy idea. It was a destructive idea from day one. And what we find here is a story of a rape that leads to terrible in-family fighting. And let me just give you some highlights from it here. Go to chapter 19 and verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. She was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her father's house in Bethlehem, Judah. After she had been there for 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servant and 2 donkeys. She took him into her father's house, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the girl's father, prevailed upon him to stay, so he remained with him 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. Now, this is the beginning of a very long story. We're going to skip on down to the end of chapter 20, or the end of chapter 19, where after delay and delay and delay, they're finally on their way home. And on the way home, they stop and they spend the night in the home of an old man. And let's pick that up here. Verse 18, we are on our way back from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim where I live. We need to go back up to verse 15. That evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the men of the place were Benjamites, came to him from his work fields. When he looked and saw the travelers in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where have you come from?" And eventually he invites them to come to their house. They stay there. Now what happens that night at the house is where this story really turns quite violent and awful. And we'll just read part of it. Verse 22, while they were enjoying themselves, some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." The owner of the house went outside and said to them, "No, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you. You can use them to do to them whatever you wish." Now, like I said, this story gets ugly faster and faster. I'm going to spare you some of the details. You can read this on your own if you like. But what ends up happening is this massive gang rape all night long. And Levite's concubine dies, and then he hacks her up into 12 pieces. He literally cuts her apart, and he sends those 12 pieces out to the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is a call to war. I mean, this thing just gets gross and ugly. And you say, what in the world is this story doing in the Bible? And then we come into chapter 20. Then all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came out as one man and assembled. And they make this plan for war. And they go to avenge what has gone on in this little town outside of Bethlehem. I mean, this thing is just gross. And it goes on chapter after chapter. And finally, you come to the end of this, and the book ends with this phrase. Turn to the very end of the book, chapter 21 and verse 25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Now, if we were taking more time to really engage this story and look at it in detail, which I don't want to do, but I want you to see this part of the story. Let me just share my screen with you again. Come back to where we were.
Doug,
Yes.
is that an example of the first honor killing in the Bible?
It is not the first one, but it is a notable example. Yeah.
Okay.
So here we come to, oh, I really messed up. Push the pause button. I missed a whole point here before I went to Judges. Okay, rewind. Come back to 2 Samuel 13. We didn't finish the phrase. So here is from 2 Samuel 13, men in power using and abusing a vulnerable woman for their own selfish purposes. And we looked at Amnon, Absalom, Jonadab, and David. The root issue is the rejection of a divine king. That's the root issue. And if you look at 2 Samuel 12:14, where Nathan is confronting David after the Bathsheba incident, and he says, you are the man. Here's what he says in follow-up. He says, by doing this, that is the adultery, the rape of Bathsheba, by doing this, you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt. David's actions were a rejection of God as the divine king. I mean, that goes without saying. But the effect was that his enemies, God's enemies, instead of respecting God and Israel, now they show utter contempt. So David's contempt for God has spread to contempt of others contempting God. David confesses this in Psalm 51, where he acknowledges his sin. He says, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. And if we go all the way back to this idea of the monarchy, before Saul is even chosen or anointed as king, and Samuel and God are talking about this idea of the monarchy and about the idea of getting a king in place. God says, well, let's just read this part of the story here from 1 Samuel 8. The people refused to listen to Samuel. He's just said this monarchy idea is a bad idea. The people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. God says to Samuel, listen to them and give them a king. It is not you, Samuel, they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. So what we see in the story of Absalom, Amnon, Jonadab, David, and Tamar takes a little while before this all unravels. But we see that some of the things that Samuel had been warning them about and saying, this monarchy thing, this accumulating of power to one person, to one family, leads to corruption. It's not the direction you want to go. And when you reject me as your king, look at what you get. And what we see in this story is the fulfillment, is some of the fulfillment of what God had said would happen. And Amnon, Absalom, Jonadab, all vying for various types of power, fulfilling various types of lust and greed, are using this vulnerable woman and the situation around it. But the root issue is a rejection of the divine king. Now, let's come to Judges 19. So, who are the men in power? Well, there's the unnamed Levite. There's the old man of Gibeah. There's the wicked men of Gibeah. There's the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba, in other words, the whole nation. And the use and abuse of a vulnerable woman, the unnamed concubine from Bethlehem. I want you to notice something here. Back here, we notice that Amnon gratifying his lust. Absalom is gaining revenge and avenging the dishonor, possibly a grab for the throne. Jonadab is currying the favor of more powerful men. David is indulging his own anxiety and shame and sorrow, and it leads to repulsive inaction. I want you to notice here in this story. Here we have these men in power. They're using and abusing a vulnerable woman for their own selfish purposes. The Levite, no, let's actually start with the wicked men. The wicked men are gratifying their lust. The old man, probably currying the favor of more powerful men. After all, this is the Levite. He's part of the leadership there. He invites him into his home, tries to do something that he thinks he'll like. He is currying the favor of more powerful men. The Levite is somewhat passive in this whole thing, a lot like David. It's the old man that's speaking up at the door. And the Levite is not protecting his concubine. And then later, when he does hack her into pieces and send those pieces out, his repulsive action. He's indulging his own anxiety, shame, and sorrow, and it leads to very repulsive action. What about the Israelites? No, they're gaining revenge. They're avenging their dishonor. That's just some of the parallels. That's some of the setup. But notice the root issue is the rejection of the divine king. If you look at the few chapters before this, in chapter 17, Judges 17 verse 6 says, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit, literally what was right in his own eyes. Judges 18:1 repeats that. In those days Israel had no king. Judges 19:1 repeats it again. In those days Israel had no king. That's the introduction of this horrible story of the Levite and his concubine. And then the book and that story ends with that phrase that I showed you already. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit, literally what was right in his own eyes.
Douglas,
Yes, Mother.
I've always thought when Judges says that it's meaning the literal king, that like they.
Mother, you're 2 steps ahead of me, but go ahead.
But it just occurred to me that it's really meaning God was not their king.
Yes, you're exactly right. It's exactly where this is going. Glad you see it. So say it again, Mother. I cut you off, please.
That just came to me as you were talking about it. That's actually what it's referring to. But they have rejected God as their king. He's not their leader any longer.
That's right. Yep. And that's what Samuel says in the passage that we read earlier, but we didn't finish the passage in 1 Samuel 8. They have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt. This is nothing new. It started with Moses, and it's carried right on through. In the time of the judges, it got really sick and bad. And now here it is in the, let me get my view of you back again here. Here it is where you say, oh, at last, a king. But it's the wrong king. Not God is their king. It is Saul is their king. David is their king. And to the degree that Saul or David led the people to their true king, things worked out okay. But in both cases, and in many cases after them, in the generations after them, the kings did not lead people to the true king. And the monarchy was a horrible idea because it took people away from the true king, turned them toward men who were using the kingship for their own selfish purposes and pulling them away from God. Now, these are two stories, and we're going to go to one final story in the New Testament. But before we do, I just want to reflect with you. I mean, I know that we've gone fairly fast here, and we haven't drawn all the parallels between these two stories, but the long view is this. And Mother, thank you for jumping in here. The long view is this, and that is ultimately, this is a story of people who reject God as their king and what happens in their individual lives, in their family lives, and ultimately in the lives of the larger communities and nations where they live when they reject God as their king. And we're going to come to a different story in a moment, but before we do, let me give you a chance to just reflect a little bit, maybe ask questions, make comments about this big picture that we're beginning to see as we fit this story into a larger story. Let me hear from anybody online, anybody in the classroom.
Doug, Gordon again. This is two.
And Gordon, we're keeping track.
I know. It just seems to me that this is a good way to look at the whole thing from Genesis to Revelation is a demonstration how sin doesn't work.
Yep.
And
Sin is a bad idea.
it really is, but what surprises me is how many times it has to be demonstrated
Yeah.
in the scriptures before God can get to the point where the whole universe, whatever that means, is going to agree that it should be wiped out.
Yeah, that's certainly the long view. Thank you, Gordon. Yeah, really good. Anybody else? Comments, questions as we're looking at this big picture?
Doug, this
Yes.
is Ruth.
Hi, Ruth.
I just want to make some parallels to our lives today,
Please.
regardless of how our nation goes. If it leaves God, and again, I recognize the separation of church and state, but as our nation leaves God, there are still individuals who can keep God as their ultimate king. And I think it's up to each one of us to face that question, if we can keep God as our ultimate king.
Yeah. Thank you, Ruth. Excellent insight. Somebody else?
I think also, I don't know if it's necessarily a case of us standing up and saying, I reject God. I mean, I don't know. I don't know about that. I think what more is likely to happen is instead of rejecting God, I'm accepting things that maybe I shouldn't be accepting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe and then I could rationalize it. Like David, what David's doing here, and he's been doing it for a while, he puts on big shows. Oh, he gets mad, and it means nothing. He gets furious. It means nothing. He's putting on a show. And what we're doing is we got to really be careful, I think, where we put so much importance. I mean, is God my God or is money my God? Is God my God or is my family my God? I mean, these are really hard and sensitive issues. So it's more of, and also, I think what's happened here, and I sure don't want to miss it, is that when I begin to accept things that I shouldn't accept, my hope is that a friend of mine has the courage to come to me when I'm not seeing it and tell me about it.
Yeah.
And whenever you have those difficult conversations with a friend, that's your friend.
Yeah.
Throw them out of your house. Because that took courage to do that. And I think that's how we can help each other oftentimes. And I sure agree with Ruth. It is absolutely one heartbeat at a time. One heartbeat at a time. And millions of heartbeats really mean something.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Excellent comments. I think that you were all able to hear that. Sometimes you've asked me to repeat comments from the class, but I think everybody.
Yes.
Please, Roy.
What I wanted to comment on is that this life of selfishness and sin becomes very dissatisfying.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at the book of Ruth between Judges and First Samuel. And
Right.
God gives us a view of what life is really like when we're
Yes.
with him.
Yes. We get this little breath of fresh air because the story of Ruth happens during the time of the Judges, and it's really the only breath of fresh air we get in the story of the Judges. Okay, we've got another story to go. I didn't want to miss. Were there any other hands up that I missed? Okay. Let me come back then to our last story. I want you to turn to the Gospel of John, chapter 8. Gospel of John, chapter 8. And remember, we're looking at long view here. And we're looking at the story of kingship and accepting or rejecting that kingship. And you're very right that rejecting God's kingship doesn't always look the way that it did for the children of Israel, who so vocally said, we want a king. We don't want God anymore as our king. We want a king like all the other nations. Sometimes it's much more subtle than that. And what we see here in John chapter 8 is when the king himself came to live among us, how his people, even the religious leaders, responded to him. And for those, please.
Sorry.
Marge, is that Marge?
No, it's Gina.
Oh, please.
I think sometimes it does look like we want to look like the people around us.
Yep.
Maybe we don't want to look, we don't actually say we don't want God, but we say we want to look like others.
Yep.
And that's the dangerous part.
Yeah, and that part of the
People who don't have God.
Yeah, that part of the story really, and Jana, that part of the story really does resonate with me, is that we may have the same rationale that they had where we say, we want to be like everybody else. And that's what rejection of God looks like. Now, don't forget what you've written on your paper. We're going to come back to that in a minute. What does it look like when you accept God as your king? What does it look like when you reject God as your king? Okay, John 8. Let's come to this story. Here is another story of kingship, of men in power using and abusing a vulnerable woman, and for their own selfish purposes. And the root issue is rejection of the divine king. Let's read it. John chapter 8. Then Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and at dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So who are the powerful men in this story?
All the men standing around.
Okay, who are they? Who does it name them as? Two groups. Pharisees and who else? See it there? Verse 3.
The scribes and the Pharisees.
Scribes, depending on the translation, scribes, teachers of the law. Yeah. So you got these two groups, the teachers of the law, the scribes, and the Pharisees, and we won't dig into that. They are two different groups, but they're working together here. Who else are powerful men here?
Jesus.
Jesus, thank you. And there's another one who's off screen here. How many people does it take to commit adultery? Where's the man? How come he wasn't called in? In fact, if they were quoting the law of Moses correctly, these teachers of the law, it says both of them are to be brought in for account. So we've got an off-screen guy here who is the man in bed with the woman. He's off-screen. So again, we have some powerful men here. The man in bed with the woman, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, and Jesus. Now, who is the woman, the vulnerable woman here who's being used and abused? Yeah, she's not named. An unnamed woman. Some people like to say this is Mary Magdalene. It might be, but she's not named. So an unnamed woman is the vulnerable woman who's being used and abused. Now, what did the man in bed? He's off screen, I know, but we can still draw some conclusions here. How is he using this woman for his own selfish purposes?
He was probably paid.
Okay, I missed that. It's probably what?
He was probably paid.
Yeah, he could have been paid. And he says, wow, I get paid for this? So potentially, he is doing two things we've seen earlier, both gratifying lust and maybe currying the favor of the more powerful men who have hired him to do this. Yeah, okay. How about the teachers and the Pharisees? How are they using this woman for their own selfish purposes?
They wanted to entrap Jesus.
Yep, they want to trap Jesus. They hate Jesus. They want to kill him. This story, by the way, takes place in the winter before, actually the fall, in the fall before the cross. So we're months away from the cross. Crucifixion happens in the spring, of course. This is the fall. And what we're going to see in just a moment is that this leads to an aborted attempt at assassinating Jesus. So this is an early death threat. Is that Gordon?
Yeah,
Number 3, Gordon.
I understand. It just seems to me that what's going on here is, I've already forgotten.
I know what you're doing. You're saving your number 3 for later in the lesson in case you need it.
I don't remember.
Hold that thought, Gordon. So we've got these teachers who are looking to kill Jesus. They're looking for revenge on Jesus. They've been fighting him for the last few years. Let me share my screen with you.
While you're doing that, Doug, I remember.
Okay, go ahead.
It just seems to me, as much as these guys wanted to catch Jesus, the fact that they just quietly walked away, it almost seems like the Holy Spirit was giving them a guilt trip.
Yeah, no question about that. Hold that thought. That may or may not be helpful for us to come back to, but just hold that thought, Gordon. Let me remind you that Amnon is using and abusing a vulnerable woman to gratify his lust. Absalom is gaining revenge and avenging the dishonor, possibly grabbing for the throne. Jonadab is currying the favor of more powerful men. David is indulging his own anxiety and shame and sorrow, and it leads to repulsive inaction. In the story that comes before this, we see the wicked men gratifying their lust. We see the old men currying the favor of more powerful men. We see the Israelites gaining revenge and avenging the dishonor. We see the Levite indulging his own anxiety and shame and sorrow, leading to repulsive action. Now in John, we see the powerful men, the man in bed with the woman, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, and Jesus. This unnamed woman, the man in bed is gratifying his lust, possibly currying favor of the more powerful men. The teachers and the Pharisees have the same indulgence of their own selfish purposes. They're gaining revenge on Jesus. They're avenging the dishonor that he has brought on them. They want to kill him. Notice Jesus. He's the only one that acts differently than the past two stories. He is removing others' anxiety, shame, and sorrow, namely the woman, and it leads to beautiful action instead of to repulsive inaction or repulsive action. Jesus is changing the trajectory of this story. And the root of this is the issue of the rejection of the divine king. Later that day, in chapter 8, and you can go and read the entire chapter, but let me just give you some highlights here from the last part of it. Jesus is in quite a discussion with these same people who had walked away and have now come back. And he says, if you were Abraham's children, then you would do the things Abraham did. As it is, you are determined to kill me, a man who told you the truth that I heard from God. Abraham did not do such things. You are doing the things your own father does. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desire. At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from them in the temple grounds. And then we go fast forward several months, and it is the time of Jesus' death. And the Thursday night of his trial, Pilate is arguing with these religious leaders. And this snippet of the conversation in John 18 reads like this. As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, Jesus, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Wow. So what are we looking at? We're looking at something that is so basic to human nature. We want what we want, and we're going to get it one way or another. And that story is told through the lens of the monarchy. And it goes clear back to the time of the judges. And there is a story that demonstrates this, and it's the story of powerful men using a vulnerable woman to get what they want. Who cares what the collateral damage is? And that story is repeated and repeated and repeated. And we've just looked at 3 incidents of it in the book of Judges, in the book of Samuel, and then in the life of Jesus. But Jesus, as a man in power and the real king, flips that story on its head. And he says, let me show you what it looks like to use your power. Let me show you how power is really to be used. Power is not to be used to gratify my greed, my lust, to curry the favor of others. Power is to be used to relieve the suffering of others. Power is to be used to stand up for the vulnerable. Power is to be used on behalf of others. That's what kingship is all about. That's what the monarchy should have been and what it never was. And a human monarchy was always a bad idea. What are you going to do when the real king is here face to face with you? And the people gave their answer, crucify him, because we have no king but Caesar. So now pull out that paper that you wrote on earlier. I want you to look at it again. Look at what you wrote before we studied this passage. Think about what we've read. Think about the way that people have acted. And see if there's anything that you might want to add to that. Does it still ring true for you? Or does what you wrote have any more depth to it than you realized? What does it look like when you accept God as your king? What does it look like when you reject God as your king? If you want to jot something in addition, take a moment to do that. If you like exactly what you've written, good. If you need to keep thinking about it, that's good too. But when we take the long view of this story, like that conversation I had with my opa, begin to say, okay, let's not just see the little picture. Let's see the big picture here. God is painting a big picture for us, as you said, Gordon, from Genesis to Revelation. And this section that we're looking at the monarchy, and the smaller section of David's life, and the smaller section of Absalom's rebellion against David, comes back to the same big picture. What does it mean for God to be king in your life? What does it mean for you to accept him? What does it mean for you to reject him? What does that look like? I hope that as a result of being here today, it looks a little clearer and a little better for you. Ken?
I want you to know that this was a very, very difficult lesson. I've been up every night, all night, for 5 days, and there was no way that I could tackle this. And this is showing how life works. God is in the room. At 7:30, I called Doug last night, and I said, well, how's it coming? And he said, it's not. How are you going to handle this? He said, I don't know. I've got it. When you have a master teacher on board, you just saw what happens when you take nothing to teach and it turns into just an event. It was an event today. Thank you, Douglas. Appreciate it. Your mom should be proud, Margaret. You raised a good boy. Yes.
This story that's about the lady they accused of being into adultery is a good thing for us Seventh-day Adventist brothers and sisters not to jump to one another, because God says, take the mote out of your own eye before you do it to a brother or sister of the Seventh-day Adventist church. And we ought to take that and have you thinking about what we do sometimes to each other.
Next week, I'll attempt to lead you in our discussion as we continue this train wreck. David is not on the top of his game anymore. He has lost his way. I don't know where Nathan is. I don't know where Dad is. I don't know who he's talking to, but he's talking to the wrong people because he doesn't even see the Nazi Jonadab that's in the palace. And he used to pick a con artist off just like that. Remember when the Amalekite or Ammonite brought Saul's crown and his bracelet? Well, David saw this as a con artist. He get away with it. But anyway, next week we hope to see you here. Thank you, Doug, again. John, would you grab our prayer?
Thank you again for bringing us all together as we enter this room. And our prayer is that we leave it slightly better. What a wonderful lesson to appreciate and understand. That though the behaviors are not, our bad behaviors are not condoned, yet through Christ and through God, we are forgiven. Help us filter everything we do with God in mind. In your name, amen.
And if anybody's not on our email list, if you want to get out, we'll have a lesson next week. I'll be happy to put you out there and see me or more. Thank you.
Hey.